The abbey bell tolled, its deep chime resonating through the cold stone halls of the monastery of St. Lumen. Cedric, once a beacon of unwavering devotion, stood beneath the arched ceiling of the prayer hall, his hands trembling as he held a scroll of damning evidence. The parchment bore accounts of embezzlement, secret deals with rival kingdoms, and whispers of blasphemous rituals, crimes orchestrated by Abbot Gregor, the man Cedric had revered as a father. Cedric's chest tightened. For years, he had poured his soul into the service of St. Lumen, trusting the abbey as a sanctuary of truth and righteousness. But the scroll in his hands revealed the decay within its foundation. This wasn't just corruption, it was betrayal. The first crack in his faith had appeared months earlier when a widow, trembling and destitute, had begged for mercy. She pleaded for leniency on her overdue tithe, tears streaking her weathered face. Gregor had dismissed her without a second glance, muttering that charity was not the abbey's concern. That moment lingered like a festering wound in Cedric's heart, growing more infected with each passing day. Now, the scroll was proof of what his heart had already feared. The Abbey of St. Lumen was no house of God. It was a den of thieves. Cedric confronted Gregor in the candlelit chambers of the abbot. The air was thick with the scent of incense, masking the stench of rot beneath. "You stand accused, abbot," Cedric's voice quivered, caught between rage and despair. "These ledgers, they show your sins." Gregor, a towering figure with eyes as sharp as daggers, did not flinch. Instead, he smirked, a chilling expression that froze Cedric to his core. "You are naive, boy," Gregor said, his tone like venom. "Do you think the abbey survives on prayers alone? The world is cruel, and power requires sacrifice." "At what cost?" Cedric demanded. His voice echoed through the chamber, bouncing off the cold, unyielding walls. "You've defiled everything this sanctuary stands for." Gregor leaned forward, his shadow consuming the fragile light of the candles. "And what will you do, Cedric? Speak of this to the High Council? They will silence you. Or perhaps you think your God will intervene." He chuckled darkly. "Faith is but a tool for those willing to wield it." Those words shattered something deep within Cedric. He had believed with every fiber of his being that faith was a shield, an unyielding armor against the corruption of the world. Now he stood bare, unprotected, realizing that even the sanctified halls of St. Lumen were not immune to the poison of ambition. That night, Cedric shed his monastic robes for the last time. The simple brown fabric that had once symbolized his devotion now felt like a shroud of lies. Beneath the pale light of the moon, he walked away from the abbey, his steps heavy with disillusionment. The wind howled through the forest as he wandered aimlessly. Villages passed, faces blurred, and seasons changed. He found work as a farmer in a quiet hamlet, plowing fields and tending sheep. The physical toil was numbing, a balm to his fractured spirit. Yet every night, the memories of the abbey haunted him. He prayed, not to St. Lumen, but to the silence, hoping for an answer that never came. Years passed in obscurity, and the once pious Cedric became a shadow of his former self. His hands, calloused from labor, no longer held scripture. His voice, once lifted in him, now barked commands at stubborn oxen. He was no longer Cedric, the devout monk. He was simply Cedric, a man with no faith and no purpose. But fate does not forget. On the eve of his 5th year in exile, the sound of hooves shattered the quiet of his rural life. A rider, cloaked and urgent, dismounted at his door, thrusting a sealed letter into his hands. The emblem was unmistakable, the royal crest of King Aldemar. "Cedric of St. Lumen," the rider said, his voice firm. "The kingdom calls upon you." Cedric stared at the letter, his heart pounding in his chest. He thought he had escaped destiny, but destiny, it seemed, had not escaped him. Cedric hesitated as the rider stood before him, his face partially obscured by the shadows of the flickering torchlight. The royal crest on the envelope seemed to burn in his hands, its weight far heavier than the parchment it contained. For 5 years, Cedric had buried himself in the anonymity of peasant life, vowing never to look back. Yet, here it was, a summons from a world he had abandoned. "You must have the wrong man," Cedric said, his voice rough from years of shouting at livestock rather than offering sermons. He made to return the letter, but the writer did not move. His piercing gaze remained fixed on Cedric, unyielding. "You are Cedric of St. Lumen," the writer said firmly. "The king does not summon the wrong man." Cedric's jaw tightened. He wanted to protest, to insist he was no longer that man, but the emblem on the envelope held an unspoken authority. Against his better judgment, he broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what he might find. The letter was brief, yet every word struck like a hammer on an anvil. To Cedric, formerly of St. Lumen, the kingdom stands on the precipice of ruin. The relic known as the Heart of Lumen, long thought lost, has been located. It is said you alone know the path to its sanctuary. Without it, our enemies will descend upon us, and the light of our realm will be extinguished. You are hereby commanded to journey to the capital at once. Your knowledge is the kingdom's last hope. By the order of King Aldemar. Cedric's breath caught as he read the words again. The Heart of Lumen. The relic had been a whispered legend among the monks, said to hold divine power that could unite or destroy entire kingdoms. He had dismissed it as a tale to inspire devotion or obedience. Now it seemed the kingdom believed it was real. The writer cleared his throat. "My orders are to bring you back alive, or..." He let the sentence hang in the air, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Cedric understood the unspoken threat, but it hardly mattered. His curiosity had already been ignited, alongside a flicker of something he thought long dead. Purpose. "I'll need time to prepare," Cedric said finally, his voice steady. The writer gave a curt nod but did not leave his post by the door. The next morning, Cedric stood at the edge of the hamlet, a simple satchel slung over his shoulder. He had left behind the life he had built, a modest field, a dilapidated barn, and a handful of sheep he had grown to care for. But as he gazed at the horizon, he realized that he had never truly belonged here. The village had been a refuge, not a home. The journey to the capital was grueling. The writer was a man of few words, his stoic presence both a comfort and a reminder of the gravity of their task. Cedric's thoughts churned with questions. Why now? Why him? And, most troubling of all, what would he find when he arrived? The city gates loomed ahead after days of travel, their towering presence both imposing and strangely familiar. The capital was a world of contrasts. Gilded spires reaching toward the heavens, while beggars lined the cobblestone streets below. Cedric felt a pang of bitterness. The abbey had once preached about serving these very people, yet they remained forgotten. At the castle, Cedric was led through labyrinthine halls until he stood before King Aldemar himself. The king was a striking figure, his silver hair a crown in its own right. Yet his eyes, deep set and shadowed, betrayed the weight of a kingdom teetering on the brink. Your Majesty, Cedric began, bowing awkwardly, the gesture foreign after years away from courtly life. Rise, Cedric, Aldemar said, his voice commanding yet weary. Time is short, and the stakes are grave. Do you know the path to the Heart of Lumen? Cedric hesitated. I know of it, he said carefully, but finding it will not be easy. The journey will demand sacrifices, perhaps more than you are prepared to make. Aldemar's gaze did not waver. If we fail, there will be no kingdom left to make sacrifices for. The words hung heavy in the air. Cedric felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders once more. Though he had turned his back on faith, it seemed faith had not turned its back on him. Cedric left the grand hall with his mind racing, the king's grave words echoing in his thoughts. The Heart of Lumen was no mere relic. It was the kingdom's last hope, a symbol of salvation for a realm teetering on collapse. Yet Cedric felt the crushing weight of doubt. His faith was fractured, his knowledge incomplete. How could he, a man who had turned his back on the divine, now lead a mission that relied on it? He was given a sparse chamber within the castle to prepare for the journey. The room's cold stone walls and narrow cot reminded him of his days in the monastery, where simplicity had been a virtue. On the small table by the window lay the map, ancient and brittle, detailing the path to the heart of Lumen. Cedric traced the faded ink with his fingertips. The route led through treacherous terrain, the forest of thorns, the cursed ruins of Hallow Keep, and the desert of shadows. Each step seemed more perilous than the last. Cedric, a voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find Sir Aldred standing in the doorway. The knight was a rugged figure, his armor dented and his cloak frayed, a stark contrast to the polished courtiers of the castle. Yet there was a quiet resolve in Aldred's eyes, a determination that mirrored Cedric's own hesitations. "You are the one who sought me out?" Cedric asked, raising an eyebrow. Aldred nodded, stepping into the room. "The king ordered it, but the choice was mine. I've heard of you, monk. They say you lost your faith, but I believe men like us can find redemption in purpose." Cedric scoffed, though not unkindly. "And what purpose do you seek, Sir Aldred?" Aldred's jaw tightened. "I seek to right my wrongs. I was once a knight of great renown, but pride and folly cost me my honor. This mission, it's my chance to prove I am still worthy of my sword." Cedric studied the knight for a long moment before nodding. "Then we may yet find our redemption together." The following day, preparations were underway. The castle's armory buzzed with activity as squires fitted Cedric with simple leather armor and a short sword. He held the weapon awkwardly, unused to its weight. Violence had never been his way, but the path ahead would not spare him the luxury of pacifism. Aldred, watching from nearby, offered a rare smile. "You'll learn," he said, clapping Cedric on the shoulder. "Stick close to me, and you might even survive." The supplies were gathered: dried meats, waterskins, a lantern to pierce the shadows, and the map itself, carefully rolled and placed in a watertight case. As they loaded their horses, Cedric couldn't help but notice the wary glances from the castle staff. Rumors of his past clearly preceded him, and not all were impressed by his presence. He felt their silent judgment, their skepticism. He tried to ignore it. Just before they were set to depart, a third figure approached. She was slender and cloaked in muted colors, her face partially obscured by a scarf. "Isolde," she introduced herself curtly. "The king sent me to ensure you reach your destination." Cedric frowned. "I thought this was to be a small party. Why send a third?" Isolde's eyes sparkled with a mix of amusement and defiance. "The path you take runs through lands controlled by those who care little for crowns or relics. I know their ways. You'll need someone who can negotiate, or deceive if necessary." Aldred grunted in disapproval, but did not argue. Cedric, too, felt uneasy, though he couldn't deny the logic in her words. The journey would demand more than faith and steel. It would require cunning. As the gates of the capital opened, the trio rode out into the unknown. Cedric glanced back at the towering spires of the castle, their silhouettes stark against the pale morning sky. He wondered if he would ever see them again, or if this journey would claim his life before he could fulfill its purpose. Ahead, the road stretched into uncertainty, fraught with danger and the promise of revelation. Cedric tightened his grip on the reins, a silent prayer forming on his lips despite himself. For the first time in years, he allowed hope a fragile foothold in his heart. The forest of thorns loomed ahead like a wall of shadow, its ancient trees twisted and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky. Cedric, Aldred, and Isolde paused at the forest's edge, their horses restless as if sensing the danger that lay within. The map had marked this path as unavoidable, but the scribbled warnings along its margins were ominous. Beware the mercenaries. Beware the unspoken law of the forest. Aldred dismounted, his boots crunching against the leaf-strewn ground. "This is where the real test begins," he muttered, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. His eyes scanned the shadows, alert to every rustle of leaves and crack of branches. Cedric felt the weight of Aldred's words. His gaze shifted to Isolde, who was already dismounting with a fluid grace. She adjusted the scarf around her face, her expression unreadable. "These mercenaries have a reputation," she said quietly. "They don't attack out of loyalty or vengeance. They attack for gold, and we have none to offer. Then why not avoid them entirely?" Cedric asked, his voice laced with unease. Isolde gave him a pointed look. "Because avoiding them means taking a longer route through the ravines of despair, where the ground itself swallows travelers. The forest is dangerous, but it's the lesser evil." Aldred chuckled grimly. "Comforting?" As they ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew thick with an unnatural stillness. The usual sounds of the wild bird song, the rustle of small creatures, were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against their ears. Cedric gripped the reins of his horse tightly, his knuckles white. He had faced moral dilemmas, spiritual crises, and the weight of his own disillusionment, but nothing had prepared him for this creeping sense of dread. "Stop," Isolde whispered suddenly, raising a hand. They halted, the horses shifting nervously beneath them. Cedric followed her gaze and saw what had caught her attention, a faint glimmer of steel among the trees. Then another and another. A dozen figures emerged from the shadows, their movements as fluid and predatory as wolves. The mercenaries were clad in mismatched armor, their faces obscured by scarves and helmets, but their weapons, swords, axes, and bows, were well maintained and ready. The leader stepped forward, a hulking man with a scar that ran from his temple to his chin. His eyes were cold and calculating, taking in Cedric's group with practiced efficiency. "Travelers," he said, his voice rough and laced with amusement. "And on such a dangerous path, what brings you through the forest of thorns?" Aldred stepped forward, placing himself between the mercenaries and Cedric. "We're passing through," he said firmly. "No quarrel with you or your men." The leader laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Passing through, you say? No one passes through this forest without my blessing, and blessings don't come cheap." Cedric's heart pounded as he realized the inevitability of the situation. They had nothing of value to offer, and these men would not be swayed by words alone. He glanced at Isolde, whose hand hovered near her hidden dagger, her eyes calculating the odds. "We have no gold," Aldred said evenly, "but we have no desire for conflict. Let us pass, and we'll be on our way." The mercenary leader tilted his head, his gaze narrowing. "No gold, no passage. But you look like you can fight, knight. Perhaps we'll take your sword and your pride." Aldred's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, an arrow thudded into the ground at his feet. The signal was clear. The standoff was over, and the fight had begun. The forest erupted into chaos. Cedric scrambled to pull his horse back as the mercenaries surged forward. Aldred drew his sword with a battle cry, meeting the charge head-on. His blade clashed against the mercenary leader's axe, the sound ringing through the forest like a tolling bell. Isolde moved like a shadow, slipping between the trees and striking with precision. A dagger found its mark in the neck of a bowman, and another in the side of a swordsman who underestimated her speed. Her movements were efficient, almost too practiced, as if she had faced odds like this before. Cedric, however, was paralyzed. He clutched the short sword given to him at the castle, but the weight of it felt foreign, wrong. He had spent years avoiding violence, and now he was surrounded by it, drowning in its visceral reality. He ducked as an axe swung toward him, the blade narrowly missing his shoulder. His survival instincts kicked in, and he lashed out clumsily, the sword grazing his attacker's arm. Aldred roared as he drove the mercenary leader back, his strikes relentless. "Cedric, move," he shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony. Cedric forced his legs to obey, stumbling toward the relative safety of a fallen tree. He glanced around, searching for Isolde, and found her locked in combat with two mercenaries, her movements as sharp as the blade in her hand. The tide of the battle shifted when Aldred landed a devastating blow, his sword biting deep into the mercenary leader's shoulder. The man fell to his knees, blood soaking his armor. "Enough," he rasped, raising a trembling hand. His men hesitated, their confidence wavering without their leader's command. Aldred pointed his blade at the fallen leader. "Call them off, or this ends here?" The leader sneered, but gave a grudging nod. "Stand down," he growled, and the remaining mercenaries retreated into the shadows. As the dust settled, Cedric collapsed against a fallen tree, his chest heaving. His hands shook, still clutching the bloodied sword. Aldred approached, wiping his blade on a scrap of cloth. "You survived," he said simply, his tone somewhere between approval and exasperation. Cedric couldn't bring himself to respond. He had survived, yes, but at what cost to his already fragile soul? The sun hung low in the sky as Cedric, Aldred, and Isolde emerged from the forest of thorns, the weight of their encounter with the mercenaries still heavy on their minds. They pressed onward, following the ancient map's directions toward the sanctuary of the eternal flame. Its name had been whispered among the faithful as a place of both reverence and danger, where the relic's power was said to have been hidden away from unworthy hands. The land changed as they traveled. The dense trees of the forest gave way to rocky terrain, where jagged cliffs loomed and the winds howled like restless spirits. Cedric felt the chill in his bones, though he wasn't certain if it was from the cold or from the growing unease clawing at his heart. The sanctuary was no longer a legend. It was real, and its truths awaited them. As night fell, they arrived at the foot of a mountain, where a series of ancient steps carved into the rock spiraled upward toward a colossal stone gate. The structure was weathered by time, its once pristine carvings now faded and chipped, but the aura of sanctity surrounding it was undeniable. Symbols of St. Lumen's light adorned the gate, though they were overgrown with moss and vines, as if the place had been forsaken for centuries. "This is it," Cedric whispered, his voice trembling. The sight of the gate stirred memories he had buried long ago, verses from scriptures, hymns sung in the cloisters, and warnings uttered in the shadows of candlelit chambers. The sanctuary was meant to be a place of ultimate faith, but also of ultimate reckoning. Isolde approached the gate, running her fingers over the carvings. "It doesn't look like anyone has been here in ages," she remarked. Her tone was light, but there was a tension in her movements, a wariness that suggested she, too, felt the weight of the place. Aldred stepped forward, examining the base of the gate. "How do we get inside?" "There's no handle, no visible mechanism." Cedric stepped closer, his gaze drawn to an inscription etched faintly above the gate. The words were in the ancient script of the Abbey, a language he had spent years studying but had not read since abandoning his vows. He translated aloud, his voice steady despite the unease rising in his chest. "Only those who carry the light within may enter. Faith shall guide their way." "Faith," Aldred muttered, scowling. "That's not exactly something we can wield like a sword." Cedric hesitated, his mind racing. He had lost his faith, turned his back on it entirely. Yet the words seemed to call to him, urging him to look deeper within. Swallowing his doubts, he closed his eyes and pressed his palm against the cold stone of the gate. He whispered a prayer, not to St. Lumen, but to the silence, to the faint glimmer of hope that still lingered in his soul. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the carvings began to glow faintly, a golden light spreading like veins through the stone. The gate groaned as it shifted, opening slowly to reveal a narrow passage lit by an otherworldly glow. Aldred whistled softly. "I stand corrected." Isolde smirked, though her eyes betrayed her apprehension. "Let's not celebrate yet." They stepped inside, the air immediately growing cooler and heavier. The passage opened into a vast chamber, its domed ceiling adorned with murals depicting scenes from St. Lumen scriptures. Cedric recognized the stories: the creation of the relic, the trials of the faithful, and the banishment of those deemed unworthy. The images seemed to move subtly in the flickering light, as if alive. At the center of the chamber stood an altar, and on it rested a crystalline structure glowing faintly with a soft, golden light. Cedric's breath caught in his throat. The heart of Lumen. It was beautiful, yet its radiance was tinged with an almost imperceptible sense of foreboding. Aldred approached cautiously, his hand on his sword. "This is it, isn't it?" "Yes," Cedric said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we must tread carefully. The sanctuary was built to protect the relic, and to test those who sought it." As if in response to his words, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The murals on the walls shifted, their serene depictions of faith transforming into scenes of wrath and judgment. A deep voice echoed through the chamber, "Neither human nor fully divine. Who dares disturb the eternal flame?" Cedric dropped to his knees instinctively, the weight of the voice pressing down on him like a physical force. "We come not to steal, but to protect," he said, his voice shaking. "The kingdom is on the brink of ruin. We seek the heart of Lumen to restore the light and defend the innocent." The voice was silent for a moment, as if considering his words. Then it spoke again, its tone unyielding. "Faith alone will not suffice. To claim the light, you must face the shadow within." Before Cedric could respond, the room was plunged into darkness. Shapes emerged from the shadows, figures formed from smoke and flame. Each one bore the faces of those they feared or hated. For Aldred, it was the knights who had betrayed him. For Isolde, it was figures from a past she had never spoken of. For Cedric, it was Gregor, the corrupt abbot who had destroyed his faith. The shadows advanced, their voices a cacophony of accusations and doubts. Cedric gripped the sword at his side, his hands trembling. He had spent years running from these demons, but now they stood before him, undeniable and unrelenting. "You cannot hide," the voice intoned. "Only by confronting your truth can you claim the light." Cedric's heart pounded as he stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the shadow of Gregor. The relic's glow pulsed faintly behind him, a beacon of hope just out of reach. Cedric stood frozen, his breath shallow as the shadowy figure of Abbot Gregor loomed before him, its smoky form almost tangible. The voice of the sanctuary echoed once more, cold and unyielding. "Face the darkness within, or perish beneath its weight." Around him, the air thickened with tension, the otherworldly silence, broken only by the low whispers of the shadowed forms taunting them. Aldred had drawn his sword, the steel glinting faintly in the dim light of the glowing murals above. He faced the specters of knights in shining armor, men who bore the insignia of the royal guard, their eyes accusing. Their voices rang out, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You betrayed your king, Aldred. You fled when your brothers stood and died. How can you wield that sword with honor when your name is smeared with shame?" Aldred's jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the hilt of his sword. "I did not flee," he shouted, his voice raw and filled with fury. "I was ordered to stand down. It was not my choice." But the shadows did not relent. They closed in around him, their voices rising in a crescendo of condemnation. Aldred lashed out, his sword cutting through the smoky forms, but they only reformed, relentless in their accusations. Isolde stood apart, her eyes wide as she faced shadows of her own. These figures bore no words, only silent stares that seemed to pierce her very soul. One shadow, taller and cloaked in darkness, reached for her, and she took a step back, her usual confidence faltering. Cedric caught her whispering something under her breath, a prayer, or perhaps a curse. But it was Cedric's shadow that struck the hardest. Gregor's visage sneered at him, his voice dripping with scorn. "You call yourself a man of faith, Cedric? Look at you, clinging to the fragments of a belief you abandoned long ago. You are no savior. You are a coward. Cedric's hand shook as he gripped his sword, his knees threatening to give way. The accusation struck too close to the truth, piercing the fragile shield he had built around himself. He had run from the Abbey, run from his faith, run from everything that once defined him. And now, he stood face to face with the embodiment of his failure. But the sanctuary's voice interrupted his spiral of despair. Faith is not the absence of doubt, Cedric. It is the courage to confront it. Those words kindled something within him. He straightened, his grip on the sword steadying. "You are right," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I am a coward. I ran because I couldn't face the truth. But running didn't make it go away." Gregor's shadow hesitated, its form flickering like a dying flame. Cedric took a step forward, his gaze locked on the specter. "I may have abandoned my faith, but I haven't abandoned my duty. Whatever I am now, I will not let you or anyone else stop me." With a final surge of determination, Cedric raised his sword and stepped into the shadow. For a moment, the world around him dissolved into darkness. He felt the weight of his guilt, his fears, and his failures pressing down on him like a physical force. But he did not falter. He stood firm, facing the abyss, with a heart no longer burdened by denial. When the darkness lifted, Cedric stood alone, the shadow gone. He turned to see Aldred, breathing heavily but victorious, the shadowy nights dissipating around him. Isolde knelt on the ground, her dagger clenched tightly in her hand. Her own specters vanished. The chamber was quiet once more, save for the faint hum of the relic on the altar. Aldred let out a low laugh, shaking his head as he sheathed his sword. "I thought we were done for," he said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "What in the hell was that?" Cedric approached the altar, his gaze fixed on the heart of Lumen. "A test," he said simply. The sanctuary was built to ensure the relic would only be claimed by those worthy of its power. Isolde rose to her feet, her expression unreadable as she brushed dust from her cloak. "And yet here we stand, worthy or not." But as Cedric reached for the relic, a sharp sound echoed through the chamber. He turned to see Isolde's dagger pointed at Aldred, her eyes hard and calculating. "Step away from the relic," she ordered, her voice cold. "This doesn't have to end in blood." Aldred stiffened, his hand instinctively moving toward his sword. "What are you doing, Isolde?" "What I came here to do," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "The king isn't the only one who values the heart of Lumen. There are others who will pay far more for it." Cedric's heart sank as the realization struck him. Isolde's knowledge of the relic's path, her cunning, her reluctance to share anything about her past. It all made sense now. She had never intended to help them. She had been sent by forces opposed to the kingdom, and they had walked straight into her trap. "You lied to us," Cedric said, his voice filled with quiet anger. Isolde's expression didn't waver. "I did what I had to do. The relic's power is too great to leave in the hands of one man or one kingdom." Aldred drew his sword, his movements slow and deliberate. "You've made a mistake, Isolde. There's no way out of here." But Isolde only smiled a sharp, bitter smile. "I've survived worse odds than this." Before either man could react, she threw a handful of powder into the air, and a blinding flash filled the chamber. Cedric shielded his eyes, coughing as the powder filled his lungs. When the light faded, Isolde was gone, and so was the relic. A heavy silence fell over the chamber. Cedric sank to his knees, his chest tight with despair. The relic, their last hope, was gone, stolen by the one they had trusted to help them. Aldred's voice broke the silence, low and simmering with fury. "We're not done yet. She may have taken the relic, but she hasn't won." Cedric nodded slowly, his resolve hardening once more. They had been betrayed, but their mission was not over. Isolde had underestimated them, and they would not fail. The chamber seemed to close in on Cedric and Aldred as they stood in the wake of Isolde's betrayal. The air was heavy with the sting of failure, the absence of the heart of Lumen, an almost physical weight pressing down on them. Cedric clenched his fists, his breath shallow as his thoughts swirled in a storm of disbelief and guilt. They had trusted her, and now the relic, the kingdom's last hope, was gone. Aldred's voice shattered the suffocating silence, sharp and filled with anger. We should have seen it. Her silence, her cunning. Damn it, Cedric. We brought the enemy straight to the relic. Cedric didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the altar where the relic had once rested. Its faint golden glow had illuminated the chamber with hope, but now only shadows remained. He could feel the despair creeping into his heart, threatening to paralyze him. But as he stood there, the memory of the sanctuary's voice echoed in his mind. Faith is not the absence of doubt. It is the courage to confront it. We trusted her, Cedric said finally, his voice steadying despite the weight of his emotions. And she betrayed us. But despair won't bring the relic back. Aldred turned to him, his expression hard. And what will? She's probably halfway to the enemy's stronghold by now. Cedric met his gaze, something resolute flickering in his eyes. Then we follow her. She's underestimating us. She thinks we'll give up, but we won't. Aldred studied him for a long moment before nodding, though his expression remained grim. Then we'll need to move fast. This place won't let us leave without a fight. The ground beneath them trembled as if in response, the walls of the chamber beginning to crack. The murals that had once depicted stories of faith and light now writhed with dark, distorted images of chaos and ruin. A low rumble filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. We need to go, Aldred said, his hand already on his sword. Cedric nodded, and together they sprinted toward the chamber's entrance. The ground shifted beneath their feet, and debris rained down around them. The once majestic sanctuary was collapsing, as if its very purpose had been undone by the relic's removal. They navigated the narrow passage with difficulty, their path obscured by falling rocks and swirling dust. At one point, Cedric stumbled, the jagged edge of a stone cutting into his arm. Aldred hauled him to his feet without a word, their shared determination pushing them forward. The light of the outside world was a beacon of salvation as they burst through the crumbling gate. They didn't stop running until they were far from the mountain, their breaths ragged and their limbs heavy. Only then did they pause, turning to watch as the sanctuary of the eternal flame collapsed into itself, leaving behind nothing but ruins and dust. Aldred dropped to one knee, his sword planted in the ground as he caught his breath. Another loss, he muttered, his tone bitter. Cedric knelt beside him, clutching his wounded arm. Not a loss, he said quietly. Not yet. The relic is still out there. And so are we. Aldred looked at him, his brow furrowed. You sound different. Cedric met his gaze, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. For the first time in years, I feel purpose. The sanctuary tested me, Aldred. It stripped me bare, forced me to confront everything I've run from. And in doing so, it reminded me that faith isn't found in relics or temples. It's found in action. Aldred was silent for a moment before nodding. Then, let's act. Let's find her. And let's finish this. Cedric rose to his feet, the pain in his arm forgotten, as he looked toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, Isolde carried the heart of Lumen, and with it, the fate of the kingdom. But he no longer felt the crushing despair that had plagued him for years. He felt something else, something stronger, resolve. The desert of shadows stretched out before them, an endless expanse of golden dunes and shifting mirages under the relentless sun. Cedric and Aldred had followed Isolde's trail tirelessly, their rations dwindling and their bodies worn from days of pursuit. But their resolve had only hardened. Each step brought them closer to the fortress of Zarin, the stronghold where Isolde would deliver the heart of Lumen to the enemy. The fortress came into view at dusk, its dark silhouette carved against the blood-red horizon. It was a massive structure, its towering walls fortified by centuries of war. Watchtowers lined the perimeter, their fires glowing faintly in the twilight. The path leading to it was treacherous, flanked by jagged rocks and hidden ravines that seemed to warn intruders of their folly. Cedric and Aldred crouched behind a cluster of boulders, surveying the fortress from a safe distance. "The main gate is heavily guarded," Aldred murmured, his voice barely audible. "Archers on the walls, patrols at every entrance. We won't last a moment in open combat." Cedric nodded, his mind racing. "We'll need to find another way in. A hidden passage, a weak point in the defenses. There has to be something." Aldred frowned. "Do you think she's already inside?" "She has to be," Cedric replied. "She wouldn't risk delay out here. If the relic is as powerful as they believe, they'll want to secure it immediately." The two men retreated to the cover of the rocks, formulating a plan. Under the cover of darkness, they approached the base of the fortress, moving silently along the jagged terrain. The air grew colder as night fell, the chill biting against their skin. Cedric could feel his heart pounding, the weight of their mission pressing down on him with every step. They found an unguarded section of the wall, its surface worn and cracked. Aldred tested the stones with his hands, nodding when he found a foothold. "We climb," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. The climb was grueling. The stones crumbled under their grip, and the wind threatened to tear them from the wall. Cedric's hands burned, his muscles screaming in protest, but he pushed through the pain. When they finally reached the top, they collapsed onto the battlements, their breaths heavy and labored. The fortress courtyard stretched out below them, a labyrinth of shadowed paths and flickering torches. Guards patrolled in pairs, their armor glinting in the faint light. At the center of the courtyard stood the relic, housed in a glass chamber that shimmered with a faint golden glow. Isolde was there, her figure unmistakable as she spoke with a man clad in dark robes, likely the enemy commander. "There it is," Aldred whispered, his eyes narrowing. "The relic." Cedric's gaze remained fixed on Isolde. He couldn't hear their words, but her posture was tense, her movements calculated. Even now, she seemed to be negotiating, her dagger ever so slightly visible beneath her cloak. He felt a pang of anger, but also a trace of pity. Whatever her reasons, she had made her choice, and it had brought them all to this moment. "We'll need a distraction," Cedric said, his voice low. "Something to draw the guards away from the relic." Aldred grinned faintly, the fire of battle flickering in his eyes. "Leave that to me." Before Cedric could protest, Aldred was already moving. He slipped down the battlements with the ease of a seasoned warrior, disappearing into the shadows. Moments later, an explosion rocked the far side of the fortress, flames erupting from a storage building. Shouts filled the air as guards rushed to investigate, leaving the courtyard nearly empty. Cedric took his chance, descending from the wall and moving toward the relic. His heart raced as he approached the glass chamber, the golden glow of the heart of Lumen illuminating his path. But just as he reached it, a blade pressed against his throat. "Did you think it would be that easy?" Isolde's voice was cold, but there was a trace of something else: hesitation. Cedric froze, his mind scrambling for a way to disarm her. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. "You've already betrayed us, Isolde. What more do you want?" She didn't answer immediately, her grip on the blade faltering for the briefest moment. "You don't understand," she said finally, her voice laced with bitterness. "The relic's power. It can't belong to one kingdom. It's too dangerous. And you think handing it over to them is the answer?" Cedric countered, his voice firm. "Do you really believe they'll use it for good?" Isolde hesitated, her resolve wavering. But before she could respond, the enemy commander appeared, his dark robes billowing as he approached. "Enough of this," he said, his voice a low growl. "Kill him and be done with it." Isolde glanced at Cedric, her eyes conflicted. In that moment, Aldred appeared, his sword cutting through the commander's guard with ruthless efficiency. The courtyard erupted into chaos as more guards flooded in, drawn by the sound of combat. Cedric seized the opportunity, knocking the blade from Isolde's hand and pulling her away from the relic. "If you truly believe in what you're doing," he said, his voice urgent, "then don't let them have it. Help us stop this." Isolde looked at him, her expression torn. For a moment, she seemed ready to strike him down, but then her gaze shifted to the relic, its golden glow reflecting in her eyes. She exhaled sharply, as if releasing a burden she had carried for too long. "I hope you know what you're doing," she said finally. Together, they turned toward the relic as the battle raged around them. The golden light of the heart of Lumen pulsed rhythmically, casting an otherworldly glow across the chaos of the courtyard. Cedric's breaths came heavy, his body weary from the relentless pursuit and the weight of what lay ahead. Around him, the clash of steel and the cries of battle echoed through the fortress as Aldred held off the remaining guards, his sword a blur of determination and fury. Cedric stood before the relic, its crystalline surface shimmering with an almost hypnotic energy. He could feel its power resonating in the air, a force both divine and overwhelming. Isolde was beside him, her dagger still clutched in her trembling hand, though her resolve seemed to crumble with each passing moment. "What now?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "Do you even know how to use it?" Cedric hesitated. The truth was he didn't. The relic's power was a mystery even to the most devout scholars of St. Lumen. But as he stared into its radiant core, he felt a deep, unshakable certainty, a calling that transcended understanding. The relic's purpose wasn't to be wielded like a weapon. It was a test, a final act of faith. "It's not about using it," Cedric said softly. "It's about becoming part of it." Isolde frowned, her eyes narrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "The heart of Lumen doesn't grant power freely," Cedric continued, his voice calm despite the storm raging around them. "It demands something in return, a sacrifice." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, even the sounds of battle seemed to fade. Isolde took a step back, shaking her head. "No, that can't be right. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Cedric said firmly. He turned to face her, his expression resolute. "This is why the relic was hidden, why the sanctuary was built. To ensure only those willing to give everything could claim it." Isolde's face twisted with a mix of anger and despair. "You don't have to do this. We can take the relic back to the king, find another solution. You don't have to die for this." Cedric offered her a faint, bittersweet smile. "If I don't, the kingdom falls. The people suffer. Everything we've fought for will mean nothing. This is the only way." Before Isolde could protest further, Cedric stepped toward the relic. The light intensified, growing brighter with each step until it enveloped him in a blinding radiance. He could feel its warmth coursing through him, filling the cracks in his spirit, washing away the doubts and fears that had haunted him for so long. As he reached out to touch the relic, memories flooded his mind. Memories of the abbey, of the widow who had been turned away, of the betrayal that had shattered his faith. But alongside the pain came something else. The faces of the villagers he had helped, the camaraderie he had found with Aldred, and the fleeting moments of connection with Isolde. For the first time, he saw his journey not as a series of failures, but as a path that had led him to this moment. The instant his hand made contact with the relic, the light exploded outward in a wave of pure energy. Cedric gasped as the power surged through him, a sensation both agonizing and euphoric. He felt his body fading, his essence merging with the relic's core. Yet he did not feel fear. There was peace in the sacrifice, a sense of fulfillment that transcended the pain. The wave of light swept across the fortress, obliterating the enemy forces in its path. The dark-robed commander let out a final, anguished scream before disintegrating into nothingness. The guards dropped their weapons, their forms consumed by the divine energy. Aldred, still locked in combat, shielded his eyes as the brilliance engulfed the courtyard. When the light finally dimmed, the fortress was silent. The remaining soldiers had fled, their resolve shattered by the overwhelming display of power. Aldred lowered his sword, his chest heaving as he surveyed the aftermath. His gaze fell on the relic, now dark and dormant, its golden glow extinguished. Cedric was gone. Isolde stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the spot where Cedric had vanished. Tears streamed down her face, though she made no move to wipe them away. She had betrayed him, doubted him, and yet he had shown her the strength of true conviction, a conviction she had long abandoned. Aldred approached the relic, his expression grim. "He's really gone," he said quietly, his voice heavy with sorrow. Isolde nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "He gave everything?" For a moment, the two stood in silence, the weight of Cedric's sacrifice settling over them. Then Aldred straightened, his jaw tightening with determination. "We can't let this be for nothing. The kingdom needs to know what he did." Isolde glanced at him, her expression conflicted. "Do you think they'll understand? That they'll believe us?" "They will," Aldred said firmly, "because we'll make them understand." He reached down and picked up the now dormant relic, its surface cold and lifeless. Together, they began the long journey back to the capital, carrying with them the memory of Cedric's sacrifice and the hope he had reignited. The capital city stirred with anticipation as news of Cedric's sacrifice reached its gates. The banners of the kingdom, once tattered and faded, now fluttered proudly in the wind as Aldred and Isolde entered through the great stone archway. Their journey back had been long and grueling, but the relic, though dormant, was safely in their possession, a symbol of hope for a kingdom that had teetered on the brink of despair. In the great hall of the castle, King Aldemar awaited them, his expression a mix of relief and grief. The sight of Aldred carrying the relic brought a glimmer of hope to his tired eyes, but the absence of Cedric was a weight that hung heavy in the air. Aldred stepped forward, placing the relic on the pedestal that had been prepared for it. "The heart of Lumen is safe," he said, his voice steady despite the sorrow etched in his features. But it came at a cost. Cedric gave everything to protect it. The room fell silent. The courtiers and knights, many of whom had doubted Cedric's worth, now bowed their heads in respect. Even those who had whispered of his failures could not deny the gravity of his sacrifice. The monk who had lost his faith had become a legend, his name now spoken with reverence. The king rose from his throne, his voice filled with solemnity. "Cedric of St. Lumen will be remembered as a hero, not just for his sacrifice, but for the faith he restored in all of us. He showed us that true strength lies not in power or wealth, but in the courage to stand against darkness, even when all hope seems lost." Isolde stood at the edge of the hall, her usual sharpness softened by grief. She clutched the edge of her cloak, her mind replaying Cedric's final moments. She had betrayed him, doubted him, yet he had shown her a path she had long forgotten, a path of selflessness and conviction. She knew now that his faith had been real, even when he himself doubted it. As the days turned to weeks, Cedric's name spread beyond the capital. Songs were written of his bravery, and villages once ravaged by war began to rebuild, inspired by the story of the monk who had given his life to save them. The relic, though silent, became a beacon of unity, its presence a reminder of the light Cedric had ignited. In a quiet corner of the castle gardens, Aldred and Isolde visited a newly erected monument, a stone pillar carved with Cedric's likeness, his hands reaching toward the heavens. Beneath it, an inscription read, "Faith is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to confront it." Aldred placed a hand on the stone, his voice low. He doubted himself, but he never doubted what was right. Isolde nodded, a single tear trailing down her cheek. He reminded us what faith truly means. As they turned to leave, the wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of incense and the whisper of a hymn long forgotten. And for the first time in years, the kingdom felt the warmth of light returning.